The summer of 1982 arrived in Harlan County, Iowa the way all good summers did, slow and deliberate, like a preacher settling into his favorite chair before a long sermon. The corn came up thick and uniform, row after row after row of it stretching from the gravel county roads all the way to the distant tree lines. That particular shade of green that old-timers called dollar bill green, because it meant money in the ground, money still growing, money that hadn't yet been lost to hail or rust or the bank. Raymond Eldon Kowalski, Ray to everyone who'd ever shaken his hand, which was everyone in a 30-mile radius, noticed the crop the way he noticed everything, quietly, without making a fuss about it. He drove his '71 Ford F-100 along the dirt lane that divided his east field from his neighbor's west field, and he looked at those stalks rising up toward a hard blue July sky, and he reached over and turned down the AM radio playing Eye of the Tiger out of the Des Moines station, and he said to nobody in particular, "That's a big corn." That was Ray's way. 2, 3 words at most. His wife Elaine had told their daughter once, years ago, that marrying Ray Kowalski was like moving in with a very intelligent dog. You always knew what he was thinking because you'd learned his particular language of silences and glances and the way he set his jaw when something was wrong. Their daughter had laughed at that. Elaine had not been entirely joking. Ray was 54 years old that summer, built like a fence post that had been in the ground so long it had become part of the landscape, lean and weathered and absolutely immovable. His hands were the kind of hands you don't see much anymore. Thick-fingered, scarred along the knuckles, with permanently darkened creases from 3 decades of grease and engine oil that no amount of lava soap would ever fully lift. He wore the same type of clothes every day, worn Wranglers, a chambray work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a John Deere cap, so old the green had faded to a color that had no real name. In winter, he added a Carhartt jacket. That was the full extent of Ray Kowalski's wardrobe philosophy. He had farmed this same 480 acres of black Iowa ground since 1952, when his father Stanislav had handed over the deed and gone to live with Ray's sister in Ames. Stanislav had come over from Poland in 1921 with $11, a steamer trunk, and an unshakable conviction that American soil was the most valuable substance on earth. He had been right about that last part, at least. The Kowalski farm sat on some of the finest ground in Harlan County, deep, dark topsoil running 4, sometimes 5 feet down before you hit clay, the kind of ground that old Swedish settlers had called God's black gold, when they'd first broken it with their walking plows 100 years before. By 1982, Ray had been farming that ground for 30 years. He'd survived the drought of '56 and the flood of '63 and the awful cold of '79 when the diesel in his tractor gelled overnight, and he'd had to pour boiling water over the fuel lines at 4 in the morning just to get the machine running. He'd survived, barely, the interest rate spike of 1980 when the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker had cranked rates up toward 20% and half the farmers in the county had gone to the bank with their hats in their hands and not come back the same. He'd survived all of it by doing what Stanislav had taught him. Keep your debt low, keep your equipment running, waste nothing, trust nothing that needs a battery more than a wrench. That last philosophy, trust nothing that needs a battery more than a wrench, was the source of Ray's reputation in town, a reputation that was delivered by his neighbors with a mixture of affection and gentle ridicule, the way you'd talk about an uncle who still insisted on reading maps instead of asking directions. Ray Kowalski was, in the charitable telling, old-fashioned. In the less charitable telling, which mostly came from younger farmers and from Doug Pressman, the manager of the Harlan County Grain Cooperative, Ray Kowalski was stuck in the past and couldn't see the future if it parked a combine in his front yard. What Ray was, in fact, was a man who had learned by hard experience that complexity was the enemy of reliability, and that reliability was, on a farm during harvest, the only thing that stood between you and catastrophe. On Saturday mornings, when he didn't have pressing farm work, and in midsummer, there was always pressing farm work, but sometimes a man needed a morning for his sanity, Ray drove his F-100 out to Gunderson's salvage yard on Route 9, about 11 miles northeast of town. Harley Gunderson had been collecting broken and discarded machinery since the Korean War, and by 1982 his yard covered nearly 40 acres of rolling ground behind a corrugated tin fence that had been rusting since Eisenhower was president. From the road, It looked like a cemetery for industrial ambition. Old combines half swallowed by weeds, rows of tractor bodies with their hoods open like sleeping mouths, piles of pipe and sheet metal, towers of old truck tires, and scattered everywhere in between, the particular miscellaneous wreckage of Midwestern mechanical life. Hay mowers and disc harrows and grain augers and threshing machine parts, and the occasional bizarre artifact whose original purpose had become entirely mysterious. Ray loved that yard the way some men loved golf courses. He walked the rows slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes moving with the same quiet, methodical attention he gave his fields. He was not looking for anything in particular. He was looking for everything, all at once. In the way that a man who has spent his life reading the land develops a kind of peripheral intelligence, an awareness that something is there, something useful, something that still has work left in it, even before his conscious mind has fully identified what the thing is. He'd found his best equipment at Gunderson's over the years. The Oliver 1655 that pulled his disc in spring, $50 in 1976. A barely used International Harvester PTO pump, still in its original crate, that someone had apparently bought and then never figured out how to hook up, $20 in 1974. Dozens of smaller things, a complete set of good condition chains for his Farmel, a carburetor for his shop air compressor, 300 feet of hydraulic hose still on the original reel. Harley Gunderson himself was a large, slow-moving man with a gray beard that seemed to collect sawdust and machine oil in roughly equal proportions. He had learned, years ago, that the best way to deal with Ray Kowalski was to let him wander, because Ray would inevitably find something that Harley had forgotten was even in the yard, and then Ray would bring it up to the shed and lay his money on the workbench without argument or negotiation, and both men would be satisfied. It was on a Saturday morning in April of 1982, when the corn hadn't even been planted yet, when the fields were still bare black and the red-winged blackbirds were just returning to the fence lines, that Ray found the bucket elevator. It was behind a row of old grain bins at the back of the yard, half covered by a blue tarp that had been rained on and frozen and rained on again so many times that it had fused in places to the equipment beneath it. Ray had noticed the tarp because of its shape, the particular rectangular profile of it, too regular to be a random pile of scrap, too tall for a standard auger. He'd pulled back a corner of the tarp and stood looking at it for a long while. It was a belt-driven flat belt bucket elevator, the kind that had been standard equipment at commercial grain operations from roughly 1910 through the 1950s, before chain-driven and then screw auger systems had replaced them. This one was a big unit. Ray estimated it at about 40 feet of total lift height, with a steel casing about 14 inches wide, the kind of industrial machine that had been built to last, and, indeed, had lasted, even if it had been sitting under a tarp for the last decade or more. The buckets, the individual scoops mounted on the belt that actually carried the grain, were cast iron, heavy and deep, designed for high-volume grain handling. The belt itself was the original flat leather belt, cracked and stiff from years of disuse, and Ray immediately knew it would need replacement. But the main frame, the head pulley housing, the boot section at the bottom where the grain entered, all of it was solid. The steel was heavy gauge, the kind they didn't use anymore, built for a world where equipment was expected to last 50 years, and frequently did. He stood there for a while, doing arithmetic in his head. The belt would need replacement. Leather flat belts were still available from Woodcraft Supply in Des Moines, expensive but not impossible. The bearings would need to be pulled, cleaned, repacked. The buckets would need to be checked individually, and a few of the bolts that held them to the belt had rusted enough that they'd need to be drilled out and replaced. The drive pulley assembly looked intact, which was the critical thing. A damaged drive pulley on a machine like this was close to a death sentence, but this one, when Ray rapped it with his knuckle, rang solid and true. He found Harley in the shed, eating a sandwich. "That bucket elevator behind the grain bins," Ray said. Harley thought about it. "Oh, that old Continental unit? Used to run at the Elgin elevator before they modernized in 68 or 69. Brought it out here when they were tearing down the old building. Thing's been sitting there ever since." 300, Ray said. Harley looked at him. "Shoot, Ray, I don't even know if the thing works." "Neither do I," Ray said. 300. Harley took a bite of his sandwich, chewed it, swallowed. 300, and you helped me move that dead Oliver combine out of the north row one morning. things blocking everything. Done, Ray said, and laid $300 in 10s and 20s on the workbench. He spent the better part of 2 weekends getting the elevator loaded onto his trailer and hauled back to the farm. He put it in the big machine shed, the one his father had built in 1938 with lumber from the old dairy barn. And over the spring and early summer, during the hours between field work and evening chores, he went at it with the methodical patience that was his most distinguishing characteristic. New flat belt from Woodcraft, $112 for the correct width and length, cut and laced at the supply house. Every bearing pulled, cleaned in diesel, repacked with fresh grease. Every bucket checked, loose bolts replaced, bent cups straightened on the anvil with a ball-peen hammer. The paint, or what remained of it, a faded green that might once have been the color of new leaves, Ray left as it was. Paint was cosmetic. Cosmetic didn't matter. By midsummer, the elevator was operational. Ray ran it for half a day off his old John Deere Model B stationary engine, the one-cylinder engine his father had used to run the belt-driven shop equipment back in the 40s, watching the rebuilt buckets cycle smoothly around their circuit, listening to the rhythm of the leather belt against the pulleys, feeling through his feet the particular steady vibration of machinery working the way it was supposed to work. He shut it down, walked around it once, nodded to himself, and went inside for supper. Elaine asked him, over pork chops and boiled potatoes, what he planned to do with it. Might need it, Ray said. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. She passed him the salt. Douglas Allen Pressman had arrived in Harlan County in the spring of 1980, dispatched by the regional headquarters of the Midwest Agricultural Cooperative Alliance to modernize and optimize the Harlan County Grain Co-op's operations. He was 38 years old, had a degree in agricultural business management from Iowa State, wore ties to work even in August, and drove a 2-year-old Buick LeSabre that he kept immaculate despite the gravel roads. The old-timers at the co-op, men like Walt Dirksen, who'd been working the scale house since 1961, and Bobby Frazier, who could back any truck in the county into the unloading pit in the dark without breaking a sweat, called Pressman the Suit behind his back, not entirely with malice. He wasn't a bad man. He was an intelligent man, genuinely well-read in the literature of modern agricultural technology, and he believed with sincere conviction that the future of American farming lay in automation, computerization, and the replacement of unreliable human judgment with the reliable logic of machines. In 1981, Pressman had overseen the installation of a new digital grain moisture testing system that replaced the old Steinlight moisture meters. The new system was faster and, when it worked, more accurate. It did not always work, particularly in cold weather when the sensor calibration drifted, but Pressman had written in his quarterly report that it represented a significant step forward in quality control capability, and the regional office had agreed. In early 1982, Pressman had begun lobbying the co-op's board of directors for a much more ambitious upgrade, a complete replacement of the co-op's main grain receiving and handling system. The existing system was a collection of equipment that ranged in age from 15 to 30 years old, a mix of chain-drag conveyors, conventional screw augers powered by electric motors with manual starter switches, and a network of wooden and steel grain distributors that directed grain into the appropriate bins. It was not elegant. It required Walt and Bobby and 2 other men to be physically present at various points in the system, monitoring flow, switching gates, keeping an eye on the equipment. It was noisy and dusty, and it ran on human judgment and experience, and the kind of intimate mechanical knowledge that comes from working the same machines for years until you can hear trouble coming before it arrives. But it worked. It had worked through every harvest for 20 years. Pressman had found a better way, or so he believed. The company was Agritech Systems out of Chicago, Illinois, a young company riding the crest of the early microprocessor revolution into agricultural automation. Their flagship product for medium-sized grain elevators was the Agritech Model 300 automated grain management system, a fully integrated package that combined a computerized control system built around an Intel 8080 microprocessor, not unlike the chip in the early personal computers that were just beginning to appear in farm offices, electric-actuated gate valves, variable speed auger motors controlled by proximity sensors, an automated grain sampling and testing station, and a central control console with a green phosphor CRT display that could, in theory, allow a single operator to manage the entire grain receiving operation from one position. The Model 300 had been installed at 11 grain elevators in Illinois and Indiana. Agritech's sales representative, a smooth young man named Kevin who wore a sport coat and carried a briefcase with the Agritech logo embossed on it, had brought Pressman photographs of those installations and testimonials from their managers. The photographs showed clean, modern control rooms. The testimonials used words like revolutionary and game-changing and the future of grain handling. The price of the Model 300, fully installed and commissioned, was $87,400. Pressman had presented this to the board of directors in March of 1982, and the board, which included 4 farmers, a retired banker, and the co-op's legal counsel, had approved it after a 2-hour meeting that had grown contentious when Ray Kowalski, who had attended as a member owner of the co-op, had asked a single question. What happens when the computer breaks? Ray had said. Kevin, the Agritech sales representative, had launched into a practiced explanation of the system's redundancy features, its diagnostic capabilities, its service contract provisions, and the fact that Agritech maintained a team of certified field technicians who could be dispatched to any system in distress within 72 hours. 72 hours, Ray had repeated. In most cases, Kevin said, depending on technician availability. Ray had nodded once, slowly, and sat down. The board had voted 5-1 in favor of the installation. Ray had cast the dissenting vote. Pressman, in the parking lot afterward, had said to 2 other board members, I appreciate Ray's perspective, but we can't run a 21st century operation with 1950s thinking. He'd been meaning to say 21st century operation with mid-20th century equipment, but he was excited, and it came out wrong, and neither board member corrected him. The Model 300 was installed over the summer of 1982, while the corn was growing in the fields. Agritech sent a 3-man installation crew that worked for 6 weeks in the co-op's main receiving building. New auger sections replaced the old chain drags. New electric motors, larger and faster than the old ones, were wired into a central panel. The heart of the system, the Agritech control computer, housed in a beige metal cabinet about the size of a washing machine, was installed in a new climate-controlled room that Pressman had built specifically to house it, with a window unit air conditioner and strict instructions that no grain dust was to be allowed inside. Walt Dirksen, who had worked the scale house since 1961 and who had watched the whole installation with increasing unease, told his wife one evening that the thing made him nervous. It's got circuit boards in it, he said, in the tone of a man describing something genuinely alien. Little green boards with little chips and wires. Everything runs off those boards. If one of them goes bad, the whole thing stops. His wife asked him what they used to do before circuit boards. We used our heads, Walt said. October came in 1982 like a gift you'd been afraid to open. The corn was ready, more than ready. The yield estimates coming out of the extension office had started conservative and climbed steadily through September until they were saying things like record county yield and historic production numbers, with the breathless excitement of scientists who have just confirmed their most optimistic hypothesis. The Kowalski farm alone was looking at better than 175 bushels per acre on 480 acres of corn. Ray had done the math in his head, standing at the edge of his east field on a clear September morning, looking at the dark tasseled stalks heavy with ears. He'd walked out into the rows and pulled an ear off a stalk and shucked the husk back and looked at the kernel set, tight, deep, fully developed from butt to tip, no gaps, no mold. And he'd let out a long, slow breath. He called Elaine from the field phone, a Motorola radio telephone unit mounted in the cab of his Deere 4440, which he'd bought secondhand and was the most technologically advanced piece of equipment on the Kowalski farm, and told her to call the co-op and get him a delivery appointment. How's the crop? She asked. It's a big corn, he said. She understood immediately. I'll call right now. Every farm in the county was in the same situation. The co-op's appointment book filled up in 2 days. Pressman organized a schedule that had trucks arriving at the co-op from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, 7 days a week, for what he estimated would be a 3-week receiving window. He was proud of this schedule. He had put it together on his Apple II computer, a machine he'd bought for the co-op office over Walt Dirksen's grumbling objection, using a scheduling program from a company in California. And the result was a tightly optimized flow plan that should, in theory, Allow the co-op to handle the entire county's corn crop without overflow or backup. The Model 300 had been running through September on test loads, and it had performed, Pressman admitted to himself privately, slightly below expectations. There had been 3 instances of sensor faults that had required resetting the system, and one occasion when the automatic gate sequencing had misfired and grain had backed up into the wrong auger section, requiring 2 hours of manual cleanup. The agri-tech technician who'd been on site for commissioning had made adjustments and assured Pressman that the system was now dialed in. Harvest began on a Monday. For the first 3 days, the Model 300 ran. Not perfectly. There were minor issues, small sensor alarms that Pressman's new operator, a young man named Gary who had received 4 days of training from Agritech, managed to clear by following the procedure in the manual. The throughput was impressive when it worked. The big variable speed auger motors moved corn at a rate faster than anything the old system had been capable of, and the CRT display showed a real-time picture of bin levels and flow rates that made the control room feel, in Pressman's words, like the bridge of a ship. Walt Dirksen, who had been reassigned from the scale house to a general oversight role that Pressman had created specifically to make use of his knowledge without giving him authority over the new system, watched the operation with folded arms and said very little. When Bobby Frazier asked him what he thought, Walt said, "It's working." He said it in the tone of a man watching a tightrope walker and noting that so far they haven't fallen. By Thursday of the first week, the co-op had received nearly 400,000 bushels of corn. The bins were filling steadily. The trucks were coming in on schedule, lined up on the county road, their CB radios alive with the particular mix of farming talk, weather speculation, and slow dark humor that is the native language of harvest. If you drove down County Road F-18 that week, you'd have seen the trucks, old grain semis from the 50s and 60s still in service on the back roads, where weight limits were more theoretical than actual, newer Kenworths and Peets with pneumatic hoppers, pickup trucks hauling grain trailers, an ancient GMC cabover that belonged to Gus Peterson and had been old when Gus was young, but still pulled its load every harvest with the stubborn reliability of a good mule. You'd have heard the CB chatter, Channel 19 mostly, the same channel the truckers used on the interstate, but here it was a different world. Farmers calling ahead to check the wait time at the scale, neighbors trading information about moisture readings and test weights, somebody's son-in-law warning that there was a pothole on the F-18 bridge that would rattle your fillings loose if you hit it wrong. In the cabs of those trucks, the radios were playing whatever KXCL or who out of Waterloo or Des Moines happened to be broadcasting. Ronnie Millsap, Alabama, Kenny Rogers. It was the year of Always on My Mind, and I Will Always Love You, and Dolly Parton and Willie Nelson singing together in a way that felt like it was about much more than romance. The year of Take It Easy and Take My Breath Away, and all the rest of the soft rock that played constantly on the AM stations between farm commodity reports and weather forecasts. Ray ran his harvest the way he always had, up before 5, in the cab before the dew had burned off, combining through the day with stops only for refueling and the brief midday meal that Elaine brought to the field in a cooler, sandwiches, usually, and a thermos of coffee, black, with a slice of whatever pie she'd made the night before. He ran his Deere 4440 and the combine it pulled with the quiet competence of a man who has performed the same operation hundreds of times and has long since moved past the stage where he thinks consciously about what he's doing. His hands and feet managed the machine. His eyes and ears managed the field. Some deeper part of his mind managed everything else, including the math that told him which fields were ready and which needed another day, and how the moisture levels were trending, and how many loads he could deliver before the co-op's appointment window closed each evening. He listened to the CB. He heard the reports from farmers ahead of him in line at the co-op. He heard when the wait times stretched from 30 minutes to an hour, and then to 2 hours on Thursday afternoon, when one of the auger sensors had thrown a fault code, and Gary had spent 40 minutes working through the troubleshooting procedure. He filed this information away without comment. On Friday evening, as he pulled his loaded grain trailer into the co-op queue, he counted 23 trucks ahead of him on the county road. The line stretched back nearly 2 miles from the scale house. The sky to the northwest was showing the particular bruised purple-green color that Midwesterners learn early to take seriously. He keyed his CB. "Walt, you copy." A moment of static, then Walt Dirksen's voice. "Go ahead, Ray." What's the weight looking like? Running behind, Walt said, with the particular flatness of a man who is not saying everything he knows. System had some trouble this afternoon. Gary's got it running again. Should be fine. That sky to the northwest, Ray said. A pause. Yeah, Walt said. I see it. What's the radio saying? Saying possible precip by Sunday. Maybe Saturday night. Ray sat with that for a moment. Possible precip by Saturday night. The line of trucks ahead of him. The capacity of the co-op system. The bushels still in the field across the county. All right, he said. He did not say what he was thinking. He went home that night after his delivery and went out to the machine shed and looked at the bucket elevator sitting in the corner, clean and rebuilt and ready, and he walked around it once with his flashlight, checking things he'd already checked a dozen times. And then he went inside and said to Elaine, I'm going to hitch up the elevator tomorrow morning. She looked up from the news she was watching, Tom Brokaw talking about something in Lebanon, and read his face. Is something going to happen? She said. I don't know, Ray said, but I want it ready. Saturday arrived gray and windless, with a sky the color of old pewter from horizon to horizon. The air had that particular October quality, thick and still, carrying the smell of cut cornstalk and damp earth, that made the back of your neck prickle if you'd lived in the Midwest long enough to know what it could mean. By 6 in the morning, the truck line at the co-op stretched back 4 miles on the county road. The harvest was at its peak. Every combine in the county was running. Every truck available was hauling, and the co-op's receiving capacity was the single bottleneck through which everything had to flow. Pressman was at the co-op at 5:30, walking the system, watching Gary run through the startup checklist, feeling the particular nervous pride of a man whose moment of proof has arrived. The Model 300 came up cleanly. The CRT display showed all systems nominal. The big Auger motors hummed. Corn began flowing in from the first truck on the scale, and the system handled it smoothly, routing it through the primary auger, through the distribution manifold, into the appropriate bin with the gate valve closing cleanly behind it. For 4 hours, it worked. At 10:17 in the morning, by the clock on the wall of the scale house, the grain dust did what grain dust does. In any grain handling operation, fine particulate matter, the dried chaff, the broken kernel fragments, the microscopic starch dust that comes off corn as it moves through enclosed metal conduits at high velocity, accumulates steadily. In the old system, with its mechanical starters and relay logic and simple electric motors, this had been a manageable nuisance. The occasional short circuit, the occasional clog sensor, nothing that couldn't be corrected with a blown fuse and a can of compressed air. The old system's electrical components were designed with large tolerances and robust contacts. They could take a certain amount of environmental abuse and keep running. The Model 300 was not the old system. The control computer's climate-controlled room was, in theory, sealed from the grain handling environment. In practice, the door seals were imperfect, and 4 hours of heavy operation with 100 loaded grain trucks coming through had created a pressure gradient in the building that pushed fine corn dust through every gap and crack, including the imperfect seal around the climate control unit's air intake. The dust had been accumulating since startup, settling invisibly on the circuit boards in their card cage, on the backplane connectors, on the traces and components of the Agritech Model 300's central processing unit. At 10:17, when Gary switched a gate valve from position 2 to position 3 to begin filling the south bin complex, the voltage transient generated by the solenoid valve's inductive kickback propagated back through the system's wiring in a way that would have been harmless on a clean board. On a board coated with conductive corn dust, it was not harmless. The transient bridged a gap it was not supposed to bridge, and in a microsecond, a cascade of logic errors propagated through the system faster than any human operator could follow. The CRT display went dark. The Auger motors did not shut down cleanly. They froze in mid-operation, with grain still in the Auger tubes. The gate valves, receiving no signal, locked in their last commanded positions, which happened to direct grain flow into a bin that was 94% full. The distribution system had nowhere to put the corn that was still moving in the Auger tubes, and within 30 seconds it had packed so tightly that the chain coupling on the number 2 Auger section sheared with a crack that you could hear from the parking lot. Gary, staring at the blank screen, said something that is not printable here. Then he reached for the phone and called Pressman. Pressman arrived at a half run from his office 200 yards away. He stood in the control room looking at the blank screen for what must have been 30 seconds, and Walt Dirksen, who had heard the chain coupling go and had come in from the scale house, watched him and said nothing. "Call Agri-Tech," Pressman said. Gary called Agri-Tech. The phone rang 7 times before a recorded message told him that Agri-Tech Systems service line was open Monday through Friday from 8 to 5 Central Time, and that for emergency service outside those hours he should call a different number. He called the different number. It rang 9 times, and then a man answered, sounding as though he'd been awakened. The man, once he'd been walked through the situation, said that he would need to get authorization to dispatch a field technician on a weekend. He said the earliest they could likely have someone on site was Monday. He said this carefully, with the practiced neutrality of someone who knows they are delivering very bad news and has been trained to deliver it without using words that could be construed as an acknowledgement of liability. "Monday," Pressman said. "That would be our best estimate," the man said. "Possibly Tuesday, depending on flight availability." Pressman stood in the control room for another moment, then walked outside. The truck line had grown during the time the system had been down. There were now, by Pressman's count, somewhere between 30 and 40 trucks backed up on the county road, more coming, and the radio chatter on the CB frequencies had shifted from the casual back and forth of men passing time in line to something more urgent. Word was getting out. The system was down. Nobody knew for how long. And the sky to the northwest had darkened from pewter to something closer to charcoal, while Pressman had been inside on the phone. The air, which had been still all morning, had begun to move. Not a clean wind yet, but that early, exploratory movement that precedes a system, as if the air is testing direction before committing to a course. Walt Dirksen came and stood beside Pressman. They looked at the sky together for a moment. "What do we do?" Pressman said. He was not asking rhetorically. He was a man who had reached the edge of his expertise and knew it, and he was asking. Walt thought about it. The old conveyors are all disconnected, and some of them are in pieces for the retrofit. We'd need 2-3 days to get them back together even if we had all the parts, which we don't. He paused. The backup auger is still there on the east side, but it's a 6-inch. Move maybe 2,000 bushels an hour, maximum. That line out there, he nodded toward the county road. There's 1.5 million bushels sitting in those trucks. More coming. Pressman did the math. At 2,000 bushels an hour, working around the clock, it would take 31 days to clear 1.5 million bushels. That's not going to work, he said. No, Walt agreed. Pressman's face had gone the color of the sky. He was a man who had staked considerable professional capital on the Model 300, who had persuaded a board of directors to spend $87,000 of member-owned money on a system that was currently sitting dead in a climate-controlled room because a speck of corn dust had killed its brain. He was a man who was, at this particular moment, facing the very specific nightmare that Ray Kowalski had asked about at the board meeting 8 months ago with 4 words. What happens when it breaks? He went back inside and sat in the control room and put his hands flat on the desk and stared at the blank screen of the Model 300 and tried to think. He was still sitting there when Walt knocked on the door frame and said, "Ray Kowalski's in the parking lot." Ray had arrived at the co-op at 11:15, pulling his old flatbed trailer behind the F-100. The bucket elevator was on the trailer, the rebuilt Continental unit, standing about 8 feet high in its loaded position, lashed down with logging chains at 3 points. Alongside it, lashed separately, was the John Deere Model B stationary engine, a 1-cylinder engine the size of a suitcase, painted faded green, with the large flywheel on one side and the power pulley on the other. A coil of flat leather belt, the new belt from Woodcraft Supply, was rolled and wrapped in burlap and bungeed to the frame of the elevator's upper section. Bobby Frazier had seen Ray pull in and had come over to look. He'd stood looking at the elevator for a moment, and then at the engine, and then at Ray, who had gotten out of the truck and was leaning against the fender. "What is that?" Bobby said. "Bucket elevator," Ray said. "I can see that. What are you doing with it?" Ray said nothing. He looked at the sky. Bobby looked at the sky too. Then he looked at the truck line on the county road. "You serious?" Bobby said. "Go get Walt," Ray said. Walt came out and looked at what was on the trailer, and his expression didn't change, but his eyes did, just slightly. A shift from the careful blankness he'd been wearing all morning to something that might have been, in another context, described as relief. "Tell Pressman to come out here," Ray said. Pressman came out. He was not a man who was accustomed to being told to go somewhere by someone else, but he'd understood from the way Walt had come in that something was happening, and right now he would have taken instruction from the parking lot itself if the parking lot had had anything useful to say. He stood in the parking lot and looked at the elevator on the trailer. His first reaction, and he later admitted this to Walt, was something close to dismissal. This was clearly some old piece of salvage equipment, obviously decades outdated, almost certainly inadequate to the scale of what they were facing. He opened his mouth to say something diplomatically noncommittal. Then he looked at Ray's face, and something in its stillness stopped him. "What is this?" he said. "Belt-driven bucket elevator," Ray said. "Continental Elevator Company. Made in 1952 or thereabouts. Rated for 45,000 bushels per hour on corn." Pressman did the math automatically. 45,000 bushels per hour. Against 1.5 million bushels in line, plus what was still coming in from the fields, plus a weather system moving in from the northwest. 45,000 bushels an hour. He caught himself before he finished the sentence. "That's more than your computer system's rated throughput," Ray said. It was the most words he'd said at once in recent memory. "Your system spec said 38,000 on the brochure." I read the brochure. Silence in the parking lot, except for the distant sound of truck engines and the CB radio and somebody's cab calling for a traffic update. "Can it actually do that?" Pressman said. How old is this thing?" "After sitting in storage. I've been working on it since April," Ray said. "New belt. New bearing grease. Buckets are all good. Needs to be set up and positioned." He looked at Bobby Frazier. "Bobby, I need to get this off the trailer and positioned next to the east bin's upper conveyor port. That port's still open." Bobby looked at Pressman. Pressman looked at Ray. There was a moment, a very particular kind of moment that sometimes occurs between men when one man's expertise has proven insufficient and another man's has not yet been tested, but the evidence of its quality is sitting on a trailer in front of them. And then Pressman said, "What do you need?" "Bobby and 2 other men," Ray said. "A forklift to position it. Access to the east bin's exterior conveyor port. And somebody needs to tell that truck line to hold position for 45 minutes. "An hour," Bobby said, sizing up the installation in his professional way. 45 minutes, Ray said. Bobby thought about it, looked at the machine, thought about Ray. 45 minutes, he agreed. What happened in the next 45 minutes was, for the people who watched it, something they would tell stories about for 30 years. Ray worked without hurry and without waste, which is to say he worked faster than most men could have managed while appearing to move at a moderate pace. The efficiency of someone who has thought through every step in advance and is simply executing a plan that exists already, fully formed, in his head. Bobby Frazier operated the Co-op's old Clark forklift, an ancient yellow machine that moved with the lumbering authority of a large animal, and positioned the elevator's boot section, the lower intake end, at the drive lane where the grain trucks would unload. The forklift then lifted the upper discharge section into alignment with the east bin's exterior conveyor port, a large square opening in the bin's concrete wall that had been used, back in the days before the Model 300, as a secondary receiving point. Walt Dirksen climbed up to verify the alignment. Two of Bobby's men, younger guys named Travis and Scott who had been standing around with little to do since the system had gone down, worked under Ray's direction to get the engine set up and aligned. The John Deere model came off the trailer on its own skids, and Ray positioned it carefully. The drive pulley of the engine and the input pulley of the elevator's drive head needed to be in precise alignment, or the flat belt would run off the edge. He checked the alignment with a length of string stretched taut from pulley face to pulley face, moved the engine 1.5 inches, checked again. There, he said. Travis and Scott looked at each other. How do you know? Travis said. Ray handed him the string. Check it. Travis checked it. It was as close to perfect alignment as you could get without a laser. Huh, Travis said. The belt, the big flat leather belt, 12 inches wide, was the heart of the whole operation and the thing that most of the watchers, and by now, a dozen or more people had drifted over to watch, including several farmers who'd been in the truck line and had gotten out of their cabs when word started moving down the CB, had never seen before. Flat belts had been the standard power transmission technology for all of American industry from roughly the Civil War through the Second World War, when V-belts and chain drives and direct-coupled electric motors had gradually replaced them. By 1982, a flat leather belt this size was, to most of the people watching, as exotic as a buggy whip. Ray unrolled the belt from its burlap wrapping, laid it out on the drive lane, and checked the lacing. The metal hooks that joined the two ends of the belt into a loop, crimped tight at the woodcraft shop. He ran his thumb along the lacing on both ends. Good. He lifted one end of the belt and walked it around the engine's drive pulley. He walked the other end around the elevator's input pulley on the drive head. The belt was slightly long, by design. Flat belts needed to run with a specific amount of sag, unlike V-belts, and the correct tension was something Ray had measured when he'd installed the original belt in the machine shed and had carried in his head since. He had brought a belt tensioner, a simple idler pulley on an adjustable bracket, from the machine shed, anticipating this. He mounted it on the elevator's frame, set the tension by eye, touched the belt with 2 fingers, and felt its weight and flexibility. He adjusted the idler a 1/4 inch. "That's right," he said, to no one. Doug Pressman, who had come out to watch and was standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, said, "How do you set the tension without measuring it?" Ray looked at him. "I measured it in my shop. I know where it's supposed to be." He paused. "You ever crack a whip?" "What?" "Same principle. Too tight, and it won't transmit the load. Too loose and it slips. There's a feel to it." He put 2 fingers against the top run of the belt, deflected it slightly, released it. "That's right." There was a silence in the assembled crowd. The wind, from the northwest, had begun to have some direction to it now, a real wind that smelled of cold and distance and moisture. Ray walked to the John Deere engine. The Model B was a 1-cylinder engine, a big cylinder, 5¾ inch bore and 6½ inch stroke, firing on distillate fuel, with an open flywheel 30 inches in diameter that served as both the rotating mass and the power output. To start it, you opened the fuel valve, advanced the spark timing, and spun the flywheel by hand, a technique that required knowing exactly where in the firing cycle to apply force, because the engine would kick back if you got it wrong, and a 30-inch cast iron flywheel moving in the wrong direction could break a wrist. Ray had started this engine more times than he could count. He did it now the way a pianist sits down at a familiar keyboard. He opened the fuel valve. He tickled the carburetor, a small primer cup, not an electric choke, just gravity and your thumb. He checked the spark advance lever, in the retarded position for starting. He put both hands on the flywheel rim at the 8 o'clock position, 2 steps back for clearance, and spun. The engine fired on the second pull with a sound that was absolutely unmistakable to anyone who had ever heard it. A single, massive, deep-chested percussion, like a drum being struck from inside a barrel, followed by the rhythmic slow-speed idle that old-timers called potato 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 for the way it sounded. Potatu, potatu, potatu. The flywheel spinning in its slow, steady rotation, the governor arm rising as Ray opened the throttle, the engine speed increasing to its working RPM with a rising note that shook the ground slightly underfoot. The flat belt began to move. It moved slowly at first, the top run lifting off the ground as the drive pulley picked up the load, and then it was running, moving from engine to elevator in a smooth, wide, purposeful loop, and the elevator's drive head began to turn, and through the casing of the elevator they could hear, they could feel, the buckets coming alive, the chain of cast iron cups beginning their endless circuit from boot to head and back again, and Walt Dirksen, who was up on the platform at the discharge end, shouted down, "She's turning clean." Ray walked to the boot section. The intake throat of the elevator, the opening through which the grain would fall, was a wide rectangular mouth at the base of the casing, positioned at truck bed height. He looked at it, looked at the drive lane, looked at the bucket assembly running clean and steady inside the casing. "Open the east bin gate," he said to Bobby. "We're ready to receive." Bobby keyed his radio. "Walt, open the east bin distribution gate. Ray says we're ready." A crackling confirmation from Walt's radio. Ray walked back to the head of the truck line and looked up at the first truck, a big Kenworth cabover belonging to Lee Hoffman, who farmed 600 acres 6 miles north of town and whose family had been in Harlan County since 1887. Lee was leaning out of his window. "Can you back to that intake?" Ray said, pointing to the elevator's boot section. Lee looked at the intake, looked at the drive lane, looked at the running elevator. "What is that thing?" "Bucket elevator," Ray said. "We'll put your corn in the bin. Can you back to it?" Lee looked at it a moment longer. "Ray," he said, "is that a leather belt?" "Correct." Lee Hoffman, 61 years old, sat in his cab for a moment with the expression of a man who has just seen something he thought was gone from the world. His father had run flat belts in the old barn on the home place, 30 years ago. His grandfather had run flat belts. My grandfather had a threshing machine with a belt like that, Lee said. So did mine, Ray said. Can you back to the intake? Yeah, Lee said. Yeah, I can do that. And there was something in his voice, not just willingness but a specific kind of gravity, as if he was participating in something that mattered, which he was. What happened next was not quiet or orderly or cinematic. It was loud and dusty and chaotic in the particular way of genuine working operations. Not the chaos of failure, but the productive chaos of many people and machines all doing their parts in the same moment, creating a din that was, to the ears of people who understood what they were hearing, the sound of things going right. Lee Hoffman backed his Kenworth to the elevator intake. His truck had a gravity flow hopper bottom, a trailer design that opened 2 discharge gates underneath the trailer body, allowing grain to fall by gravity when the gates were opened. He opened the gates, and corn fell in a golden rush, more than 1,000 bushels in that trailer, and it fell into the boot section of the elevator with a sound like continuous distant thunder. The buckets caught it. Loaded full, 60 pounds of corn per bucket, cycling upward at a rate that defied intuitive expectation. The big leather belt was moving fast, the buckets rising in their column every fraction of a second, and at the top, in the discharge head, each bucket released its load in a clean arc into the distribution chute that Walt Dirksen had connected to the East Bins port. The engine went patat-tu, patat-tu, patat-tu. The belt moved. The corn flew. Bobby Frazier was watching the intake, watching the grain level in the truck trailer dropping, watching the buckets fill and rise, and he said to Travis in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, "That thing is hauling corn." Travis, 23 years old, who had been born the year that Continental Elevator Company had manufactured this machine, watched it with the complete attention of someone seeing something genuinely new to him. "How fast?" he said. Bobby looked at the flow rate, did the rough arithmetic that 20 years of elevator operation had wired into his instincts. "Better than 40,000, he said. "Maybe more." Lee Hoffman's trailer emptied in 8 minutes. He pulled forward, the second truck backed in. It was Denny and Carl Ostergaard, brothers, third-generation farmers, their old white road commander pulling a 16-foot hopper wagon. And they opened their gates and the corn fell and the buckets filled and flew and the belt went around and around and the engine went patat-tu and the corn went into the bin. By noon, they had moved 120,000 bushels. The wind from the northwest was steady now, cold and direct, and the cloud mass that had been building all morning had developed the kind of hard anvil edge at its leading line that told experienced weather watchers exactly one thing. This is moving fast, and it is bringing rain. The CB radio in the co-op scale house was monitoring the NOAA weather broadcast, and at 12:30 Walt Dirksen's radio came alive with a static-laced voice from the scale house. "Walt, NOAA is saying heavy rain by 5 o'clock. Significant. They're using the word substantial." Walt looked at Ray, who was standing at the elevator intake watching a truck back in. Ray had heard the radio. "Patat-tu," said the engine. The belt went around. "Get the word down the line," Ray said. "Tell everyone to stay in position. Nobody leaves line for any reason." Word went down the CB network, and if you had been listening on Channel 19 that afternoon, you would have heard something happen in the chatter on the frequency. A change, a focus, a collective understanding moving through the network of farmers and truck drivers stretched out along County Road F-18 and back into the farm roads beyond. They understood what was coming. They had all grown up understanding what it meant when the rain came before the corn was in. They had all heard stories from their fathers and their fathers' fathers about harvests lost, about corn gone moldy in the wagon, about a year's work turned to waste in an afternoon by weather that didn't know or care about the work that had been done. There would be no breaks. There would be no lunch stops. There would be nothing but the line moving forward and the corn going into the elevator and the buckets flying and the belt running and the engine going patat-tu in its steady ancient rhythm. Pressman, who had been standing and watching for 2 hours, went and got a pair of work gloves from the scale house and came to find Ray. "What can I do?" he said. Ray looked at him. "Keep the intake throat clear. Corn piles up sometimes at the edges, slows the bucket fill. You use this." He handed Pressman a wide-blade push broom. the kind with a 4-foot head on a long handle, used for sweeping grain floors. Anytime you see corn building up at the throat edges, sweep it to center. Pressman took the broom. He stood at the elevator intake in his good slacks and his dress shirt with his tie folded into his shirt pocket, and he swept corn for the next 4 hours without complaining once. Walt Dirksen, watching this from the distribution platform above, said to Bobby later, "I'll give him that much." The afternoon moved the way afternoons do when the stakes are real and the work is good. It compressed. Trucks came and went. The line shortened. The corn flew into the bin. The engine sang its deep, one-lunged song. Around 2 o'clock, Ray's neighbor Harold Bremer pulled out of line and drove around to where Ray was standing. Harold was 70 years old, had been farming since before the Second World War, and had the kind of face that a landscape acquires over many years, deeply lined, calm, marked by weather and season in ways that a photograph could capture but couldn't fully explain. He got out of his truck and stood looking at the bucket elevator for a while. "That's a Continental unit," Harold said. "Correct," Ray said. "My father had one of those. 38, 39 foot. Almost exactly like this." Harold walked to the elevator and put his hand on the casing, and the vibration of the running buckets came up through the steel into his palm, and he stood there with his hand on the machine and his eyes distant. "We ran it off a John Deere D. He called it the big engine." Harold smiled. A slight, private smile, the kind directed at a memory rather than a person. "Same belt. Flat belt, leather. He used to dress it with neat's foot oil every spring. Said a dried belt was a wasted belt." "I used the same," Ray said. Harold was quiet for a moment. "We were out of the grain elevator business by, 61. Put in one of the early chain systems. My father stood and watched them install it, and then he went inside and didn't come out for the rest of the day." Harold paused. "I thought he was being stubborn, being sentimental about old equipment." He looked at Ray. "I think maybe he just knew something I was too young to understand." Ray said nothing for a moment. Then, "He probably knew that anything simple enough to fix with a wrench is more reliable than anything that isn't." Harold nodded. "That's probably what he knew." He got back in his truck to advance in line. Before he pulled away, he said, "Your dad would have gotten a kick out of this." "Yeah," Ray said. "He would have." By 3:30 in the afternoon, with the wind now sharp and purposeful out of the northwest, and the cloud wall close enough to see individual features in its base, they had moved 480,000 bushels. The east bin was full. Ray had coordinated with Walt to redirect the elevator's discharge into the center bin complex through a temporary flexible conveyor section that Bobby and Travis had rigged up, a classic improvised connection, the kind of solution that emerges when people with real mechanical knowledge are working together without bureaucratic friction. The center bin began to fill. Several of the farmers who'd already delivered came back, not because they had more grain, but because they wanted to see it through. Gus Peterson was one of them, the old man with the ancient GMC cab over, 81 years old that October, who had been farming since Calvin Coolidge was president and who arrived with a metal thermos of coffee and passed it around without comment. Someone had brought sandwiches. Someone else's wife had arrived in a station wagon with 2 loaves of bread and a pound of bologna and a jar of mustard, and she set it all out on the hood, and people took what they needed and kept working. The CB radio chatter had changed entirely. There was no small talk now, no jokes, no time-passing commentary. It was all operational, all specific, truck positions, estimated unload times, bin-level reports from Walt, weather updates. And underneath all of it, constant and steady and completely reliable, the engine's voice, patat, patatu, patatu. Ray moved as needed, speaking only when something needed to be said, his eyes going constantly from the intake to the belt to the engine to the sky and back to the intake. He checked the belt tension twice, adjusted it once by a fraction. The leather had expanded slightly as it warmed and was moving under load, which was normal and expected. He checked the bearing temperature at the drive head pulley with his bare hand. Warm, not hot. Good. A chain-type auger would have needed retensioning at this point. An electric motor drive would have been generating fault codes from its thermal overload protection. A computer-controlled system might have been triggering automatic shutdowns to prevent damage. The leather belt ran on. The John Deere engine went patat-to. At 4:45, the first drops of rain hit the dust on the county road. They were fat, heavy drops, the kind that come ahead of a serious system, and each one raised a tiny impact crater in the dust, and then was absorbed. Walt Dirkson's radio crackled. "Ray, how many trucks left?" Ray counted the line. 7, he said. 7 trucks. At the current throughput, at the bucket elevator's honest rate of better than 40,000 bushels per hour, and with 600 bushels average per truck remaining, roughly 6 or 7 minutes of operation. The rain began in earnest at 4:52. Real rain, driving rain, the kind that soaks through a work shirt in 30 seconds and turns the gravel in a farm drive to mud in 5 minutes. Everyone in the operation, Ray, Bobby, Travis, Scott, walled up on the platform, Pressman sweeping with his broom, the farmers in the truck line, the half-dozen men who had gathered to help and stayed to finish, got wet. Nobody moved toward shelter. The engine went pa-tat-too. The belt ran. The buckets flew. The grain went in. The last truck was Norbert Kuehl's, a small operation, just a pickup and trailer, 250 bushels of corn from his 30-acre bottomland field that he'd been farming alone since his son had gone to work in the city. Norbert was 68, stiff in the joints, and he needed help aligning his trailer to the intake, and Travis ran out in the rain and guided him back. The gates opened. The corn fell. The buckets caught it and carried it up and discharged it, and carried it up again, and it was done in less than 2 minutes. Ray walked to the John Deere engine, put his hand on the throttle, and eased it back toward idle. The engine slowed, pa-tat-too, pa-tat-too, then slower still, a pace like a resting heartbeat, and Ray reached over and closed the fuel valve, and the engine fired twice more on what was in the bowl, and then went silent, and the great flywheel turned in its own momentum for 30 seconds, slowing, and stopped. The belt lay still. The rain hammered on the corrugated metal of the elevator casing, and on the roof of the scale house, and on the roofs of the grain trucks, and on the county road, and on the corn stubble in the fields stretching away in every direction, and the sound it made was the sound of rain on the Iowa prairie in October, which is not a gentle sound, but is a good sound when the corn is in. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Bobby Frazier said, quietly, "That's all of them." And that was the end of it. Walt Dirkson climbed down from the distribution platform, moving carefully on the wet ladder, and stood in the drive lane looking at the elevator. His boots were covered in grain dust, and his face was wet from rain, and his eyes had an expression that is difficult to name. Something between recognition and relief, like a man who has found, after a long search, a thing he had been half afraid was gone from the world forever. He walked over to Ray, who was standing by the John Deere engine with his hand resting on the flywheel, and he said, "That's a hell of a machine, Ray." "It's a good machine," Ray said. "Where'd you find it?" "Gunderson's." Walt nodded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, which to both men it was. He looked at the belt, running water off its leather surface in small sheets. "What did you pay for it?" $300. Walt thought about this. $300, he repeated, in the tone of a man performing a specific kind of arithmetic. Then he smiled. A small, contained smile, the kind that doesn't need to be large to be complete. $300, he said again. That was the whole of his comment. It was enough. Pressman came and stood with them. He was soaked through, his good shirt ruined, his slacks dark with rain and dust and grain chaff. He had been sweeping grain for 4 hours. He looked different from the man who had arrived at the co-op that morning. Not different in a bad way, just differently arranged, as if something had been redistributed. He stood looking at the elevator for a long time. "How did you know it would work?" he said. Ray looked at him without particular expression. "I rebuilt it. I ran it in my shop. I knew it would work. But you brought it here today. You showed up with it before you even knew the system had failed." Ray was quiet for a moment. He looked at the sky, which was fully committed to rain now, a gray solid curtain of it, moving across the fields in waves. "The system wasn't going to last," he said. "Not in this kind of dust, not running continuous like this. Early computer gear doesn't like that environment. I knew that." He paused. Didn't know exactly when it would go. Just knew it would go. Pressman absorbed this. "Why didn't you say something?" Ray looked at him with the steady gaze of a man who has been underestimated for a long time and has made a certain peace with it. "I did," he said. "At the board meeting. I said, what happens when it breaks?" The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need filling. "I'm going to have to explain this to the board," Pressman said, finally. Not with self-pity. It was a practical statement, a man taking inventory. Probably, Ray said. Agri-Tech is going to say the installation was abused, that the environment wasn't properly controlled. Probably, Ray said again. Pressman looked at the elevator. What will you do with it now? Put it back in the shed, Ray said. It'll keep. Pressman nodded slowly. He looked as if he wanted to say something more, something that would adequately address what had happened today, the disproportion of it. $87,000 versus $300, the most sophisticated grain handling technology available versus a machine built in the year that Eisenhower was elected, the failed system and the one that had not failed. He was an intelligent man, and he understood the lesson. He just wasn't sure he had words for it, or that the man standing beside him would want to hear them. He put out his hand. Thank you, Ray. Ray shook it. You held a good broom, he said. For a manager. Pressman laughed. A genuine laugh, surprised out of him. He hadn't expected that. He wiped rain off his face with the back of his hand. I'll take that, he said. The rain lasted 2 days. When it cleared on Monday morning, the fields lay under a sky washed clean, and the corn stubble was dark with moisture, and the co-op's bins were full, every bushel of the 82 bumper crop secured and safe. The Agri-Tech technician arrived on Tuesday, as promised, and spent 3 days diagnosing the Model 300's failure and determining that the main CPU board was unrecoverable. A replacement board was ordered. The system was eventually repaired and put back into service. It failed again the following harvest, this time due to a different cause, a software timing error in the gate sequencing logic that caused a mismatch between the bin level sensors and the Auger speed control, resulting in a grain overflow event that damaged 3 sensor assemblies. The repair cost was $11,000 and took 9 days. The year after that, the Harlan County Co-op's Board of Directors voted to install a backup receiving system alongside the Model 300. The backup system was a rebuilt chain drag conveyor and a pair of conventional fixed-speed auger motors with relay starters, the same basic technology that had served the co-op before the Model 300's installation. The motion passed 7-0. Pressman voted in favor. Ray never mentioned any of this. He didn't need to. The bucket elevator went back into the corner of the machine shed where it lived, under a canvas tarp that Ray reapplied with Near's Foot oil every spring, the way Harold Bremer's father had taught about such things. Every fall, before harvest, Ray started the John Deere Model B engine, Potet 2, and ran the elevator for half a day with a test load, checking the belt tension and the bearing temperatures and the bucket condition, making sure everything was right, making sure it would be ready. It was always ready. Machines that are understood, that are maintained, that are respected for what they actually are rather than what you wish they were. Such machines are nearly always ready. Ray farmed his 480 acres until he was 68, when his back finally told him it had done enough. And then he rented the cropland to his neighbor's son and kept the farmstead and the machine shed and the old orchard along the south fence. He kept the Model B engine until he died, kept it clean and oiled and functional. And when his son-in-law once suggested that maybe it was time to get rid of some of the old equipment, clean things up a little, Ray had simply looked at him with the expression that Elaine had described to their daughter as the language of a man who knows something and chooses not to explain it to people who aren't ready to understand it. The elevator stayed too. There is a specific kind of knowledge that cannot be put in a manual or uploaded to a computer or transmitted through a brochure with photographs of clean control rooms and testimonials from satisfied customers. It is the knowledge of things that break and the things that don't, of the difference between complexity and capability, of the irreplaceable value of a machine that will start in the rain on a bad day with a bad sky and do what it was built to do for as many hours as it takes to get the work done. It is knowledge purchased not with dollars, but with decades, with patience, with the willingness to spend a Saturday morning walking the rows of a junkyard and seeing, in a half-covered piece of iron and leather, something that someone else has discarded but has not yet entirely been used up. Ray Kowalski had that knowledge. He had gotten it the way his father got it before him, and Stanislav before that, and all the way back through whatever chain of farmers and mechanics and careful, stubborn, clear-eyed men had passed it forward from one pair of working hands to the next. He had never been paid for it, never given a speech about it, never written it down. He hadn't needed to. On the morning of October 12, 1982, with the rain coming in from the northwest and 30 years of corn in the balance, he had put it on a trailer and driven it to town, and it had been enough. It had been, in fact, more than enough. The John Deere Model B engine, if you stand close to it when it's running, produces a sound that has no modern equivalent. It is not the sound of sophistication or efficiency or the future. It is the sound of iron and combustion and the specific kind of confidence that comes from understanding exactly what something is, what it can do, and how to make it do it. It is the sound that Stanislav Kowalski heard in the machines of his era, that Ray grew up hearing in the shed behind the house, that Harold Bremer's father heard running beside a similar machine in a barn that no longer stands. Patatu, patatu, patatu. It is the sound of a thing that works.